Hello dear friends, how is it going? I hope all is well at your end, and if not, I wish upon you a rapid change of fates. I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to speak about landscapes connected to water, mostly the sea and probably rivers as well in Nordic mythology. This video today is probably the first part of this theme. I'm not sure where this is going and the development of this subject. You see, a patron of mine asked me to talk about the folkloric being called Nykur, the water spirit, which appears in several accounts of Nordic folklore. But I really didn't know where to start because in order to understand this being of Nordic folklore, I think it is important to explore its background in terms of Nordic mythology and the relationship between Nordic peoples and the sea and rivers and water in general, which helps us to understand the cultural weight somewhat preserved in folklore, which ends up being a good source to express a more animistic line of thought that connects us to the timeless living landscapes both us and our ancestors have lived upon. And in a certain way, it still calls to us and it is still part of our life. So, there's a lot to talk about. As such, I have decided to divide this video probably into three parts, no more than that, I hope. The last part being precisely about the Nykur. And this will also help me to deliver information to other patrons of mine who have been asking for sea-related subjects concerning Nordic cultures. By the way, I take the opportunity to tell you that I have already done a video in the past concerning water as an element connected to the other world and even the afterlife in Nordic mythology. So if you have the time, please watch that video. And at least that part is covered and we don't have to go through it all over again. So today's first part will be about cosmological conceptions involving the sea and the rivers found in the Eddas as literary sources that have somewhat preserved, to a certain extent, Old Norse mythology. I don't think I will focus this time in other bodies of water such as lakes and underground waters, as I have done in that past video previously mentioned. I've already done that. But this time I shall instead solely focus on the sea and probably rivers as well. So, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends. Please. Let's start with the famous 13th century literary source known as the Prose Edda, where it is possible to distinguish some perceptions of the medieval imaginary about the places and functions of aquatic realms in Nordic cosmology. As was said before, in that video I've mentioned about the Nordic afterlife realms, there are seas, rivers and lakes as waterscapes, where not only there is a great development of life, but they also serve as links between worlds, realms, landscapes, deities, events, and it really seems that water played a very important role even in the recreation in the world of the living of cosmological environments, creating an enactment of the afterlife worlds and realms in death rituals, something I've spoken about in that previous video. Let's move on. This is why these waterscapes are frequently referred to in surviving literary sources. Water, in addition to delimiting territories, aquatic surfaces are also related to the maintenance of life and are also associated with some mythological beings such as primordial creatures, giants, Jotnar, and curiously are also related to the fate of mortals, be those humans, gods or other entities. We have the case of the famous prophetesses and weavers of faith, the Norns, who nourish the tree of life with water from the sacred well. So water not only is a source of life from the beginning of life, but it is also linked to the destiny of the life of the entities that arise from this element, something we shall talk about further ahead. In the Prose Edda in Gylfaginning, we begin right away with the involvement of water in the creation of the world. Through the death and dismemberment of the body of the cosmic being Ymir, it was possible to create the world, and from its blood the sea and lakes were created. Rocks from his bones, or from its bones, stones from his teeth, etc., etc. But from the blood which flowed from its wounds, the sea was then created, which circumscribes the earth. The sea and lakes, therefore, would have their formation from the manipulation that the sons of Bur, Odin, Vili, and Ve, made of Ymir's blood. The relationship between blood and body is something present in many beliefs of various societies, with blood being the vehicle element by which the body ensures its life and its centrality of physical existence, as well as serving as a metaphor, as the key element in the construction of a society and its cultural identity. Perhaps this is how the relationship between sacrifice and religion in ancient societies begins to make sense, or at least a certain sense, as a way of recreating cosmological events to ensure the continuation of life in human societies. Precisely recreating mythological accounts with a strong magical religious focus on the cosmic elements that provide life. The body parts of Ymir provide the material to form the world, and its blood mainly is used to create aquatic environments such as the sea and lakes. I think it won't be necessary to talk about Ymir again, since I've made a video on this topic before, but maybe it's also important to remember Kvasir's sacrifice and blood as a ritual element of life and creation, as well as connecting it with spiritual essence and as the vehicle to obtain divine force and knowledge and be in contact with the divine. So if you don't mind, check it out here in this information icon in your upper right corner, these suggested videos. The important thing here to remember is to remember these elements of sacrifice and the use of blood in Norse mythology are something that, like in other mythologies and societies, would be recreated in specific ritual moments and of great religious importance. However, it is relevant to note that all parts of Ymir's body were used and that its blood, obtained through extreme violence, from the blood that flowed from its wounds, right, did not originate aquatic environments on its own, but it was manipulated by the gods for the very purpose of the seas and the lakes, to create the seas and the lakes. Ymir's death not only results in the formation of the world, but also causes the drowning of the entire race of giants, with the exception of Hvergelmir and his family, who managed to escape the flood of blood. The sea and the lakes, before taking on their shapes and encircling the earth, were the blood that the gods shed from the primordial giant. The flow was such that it was also responsible for exterminating the race of frost giants, whose offspring came to depend on Hvergelmir and his consort. If I ever have a son, I will call him Hvergelmir. Hvergelmir, my son, come over here and help me to raise this mountain. Yes, Papa. Of course, we have a lot of elements in this myth that are Christian religion's understandings, and some of them directly taken from biblical tales of biblical sources, as I have mentioned in other videos, which is not strange since we are dealing with medieval sources largely within a Christian religious mentality, Icelandic Christian religious mentality, medieval mentality. But that does not devalues nor does it denies the pre-Christian content that we also find in these accounts. Here we continue to see the element of blood that is shed, and whatever its origins may be, it is considered unclean unless it is associated with a sacrificial act. That's why we continue here to understand this pre-Christian mentality and the importance of sacrifice to hallow the blood, to make it pure, giving it a divine, sacramental, sacred purpose, right? Turning it into a sacred element. Ymir is murdered by Bur's sons, but the justification for this act is given, and we can read it through the narrative presented here, since Ymir's assassins did not consider it or did not recognize it as a god, but considered it an evil. By the death and the use of the blood of this cosmic entity, the gods have hallowed the blood and body of the cosmic being and thus created the earth through the act of sacrifice. And such a sacrifice as the magical religious behavior to hallow matter in order to reshape it, to create something far greater and with a divine purpose. The same way ancient societies would sacrifice and hallow the sacrificial elements in order to transform them from ordinary matter into sacred offering, to give it a divine purpose, to create or to force something greater which the human societies will be able to use or obtain for a better outcome. Therefore, the motivation for Ymir's murder, combined with the use of the victim's body and blood for specific purposes, in this case the creation of the world or the earth, perhaps it could be interpreted that it was not just a murder that took place, but a sacrificial event performed by the gods to end a time dominated by the race of the ice giants or frost giants and the beginning of the creation of the world. A sacrificial act to establish the breaking of a period and the beginning of a new one, a new period, a new era. The same way as we see in human societies, the sacrifices performed on specific occasions throughout the year or in the course of a number of years to establish the end of a time or period and the beginning of a prosperous period. The annual sacrifices and or the sacrifices every 9 years at Old Uppsala, marking the end of a period and the beginning of a new period of peace and prosperity, or even the sacrifices we find in some sagas of prominent figures whose death through sacrifice comes in a time of great famine, and so the sacrifice becomes the sacramental act to end a period of strife and the beginning of a more prosperous period. The gods considered Ymir to have an evil nature, and when this is evident, culminating in Ymir's annihilation, the proper conditions are established to bring about balance that did not exist in the previous period before the creation of the world, as the cosmos was still quite chaotic. From this moment onwards, the giants become enemies of the gods, and their deaths usually represent the re-establishment of order in several mythological accounts. I think it is pertinent to say that perhaps we can see here a certain primordial tribalism in one of the processes that may have helped certain communities to minimize or try to minimize violence within the communities themselves. Here, sacrifice seems to be a form of protection for the community itself, trying to resolve internal violence by resorting to a victim chosen outside the community, leading to an external sacrifice so that there is no internal sacrifice. I've already spoken here in another video about animism and the involvement between the shaman figure and the hunting and the hunters, where I have demonstrated that sacrifice, or rather hunting and being hunted as a sacrifice, constitutes a sacrifice. Hunting and being hunted is implicit within the indigenous animistic mind as an act of sacrifice. That is, it is unpleasant, unwanted, undesirable, and unexpected. As such, it is something unwanted within the human community as well, but sometimes it is necessary, for whichever reasons that made sense in past societies. The point here is that sacrifice becomes meaningful and sacramental, and we see this in the process of hunting as well, as an example, which is not an action taken lightly, and it is to be avoided unless it is extremely necessary. Therefore, the killing of an animal becomes sacrifice, a sacramental act to give meaning and to properly propitiate the spirit of the hunted animal kin. I've explained this before, no point in repeating that. However, human sacrifice becomes even more problematic within the human community. As such, the sacrifice of human victims were usually of members of the community that were not wanted within the community itself for a variety of reasons: murder, breaking of taboo, etc. And so the sacrifice becomes a sacramental act with a meaning and purpose which is given to the unwanted member of the community. Thus, in a way, this person redeems itself from its actions that have caused some imbalance and even curse upon the community. Or the sacrifice of a human victim was someone from the outside of the community to avoid violence within the community, avoid the desire to sacrifice within the community, and seeking out someone external precisely to minimize the conflict within the community, to avoid death within the community. Such human victims from outside the familiar nucleus of the community were usually rivals, foes, war prisoners, someone the community was in conflict with. And we see this with Ymir, precisely. The gods sacrificed the very being with which they were in conflict with. The choice for Ymir, who was not considered a god, denoting here a difference and inferiority between victim and aggressor, characterizes the choice of the gods for the sacrifice of the other to establish a new ordering of the world, from which a greater meaning and purpose is established, as well as to establish order. The sacrifice of the other, in this case of Ymir, becomes a sacramental act from which something beneficial will result for the community, through an act of extreme violence outside the community to avoid conflict and violence within the community. Returning to the passage we saw earlier, in Old Icelandic there are two terms for sea, the sea, Sai and Sjó. Sair and Sjór are understood as sea or ocean, but Sjó can also denote the action of seeing, perceiving, or understanding. Focusing on this particular linguistic play of words, perhaps there is an intention here, purposely, to associate an element with forms of knowledge or of knowing, seeing, perceiving, to understand, linking these senses to aquatic environments. Then we have the word vatn, which corresponds to lake and also water and tears, while its plural, vatn, can designate wide rivers. These terms show both the semantic proximity between aquatic environments in the Old Norse language, in this case Western Old Norse, and similarities of these environments with fluids and senses of the human body. The attribution of wisdom to water or aquatic environments is found in other texts, but I would like to once again recall Ymir. Here, mythology isn't simply a cultural account to convey information concerning the syncretism of religiosities, but it is also for literary purposes, for education in language, written form, oral form, as well as creating associations, easy associations, for a better understanding of language itself. There's Ymir, from whose body the world is created. The physical attributes of the body and the associated senses are transformed into matter to create the world. So the very sense of seeing and understanding is turned into water, the oceans, the lakes and rivers, giving life to the natural environment itself, giving an identity and sentience. Water is characterized in creation myths as the source of all life. Before the formation of the world, there are passages about the beginnings of existence and the environment that provided the emergence of Ymir, involving very specific rivers. I'm going to put another passage on the screen, somewhere in here, where we clearly have Hvergelmir, and at its center is the spring that is called Hvergelmir, and from it flow the rivers with their specific names. We have here, in a way, a system of water routes that spread throughout the cosmos and eventually into other realms of Nordic cosmology, nourishing life, coming from a central point, a wellspring of life, as it were. In Old Icelandic, the term used to define Hvergelmir is brúðr, which is conventionally translated into modern English as spring. The term brúðr is an old form for brunnr, which is the equivalent to spring or well. However, it is possible to translate brunnr as referring to a body of water, not only as a source built by human actions, such as, for example, a well, but also a natural spring. As you know, we have the term Mímisbrunnr, the well of Mimir, the well of knowledge, located beneath the world tree Yggdrasil, which we shall talk about further ahead. Continuing with the same passage, we also have the term hor, singular hor, which is equivalent to rivers. The different terms used for bodies of water in this passage indicate a cognitive understanding of the landscape that contributes to a better understanding of the mythological arrangement about the involved environment and, consequently, of the imaginary Old Norse belief systems. We are in the presence of a mythology that is capable of immersing the audience into the very environment, being in contact with what can be seen and known and experienced in life, in the natural landscape, and at the same time also helping to understand the belief systems through these associations. Then we have, of course, several rivers which reinforce this human experience and the junction between the religious and the everyday life. The river plays a central role both in people's physical lives and in the religious and cosmological conceptions of these same people. It is natural that many societies have always had the tendency to settle near rivers for a variety of reasons. And for this very reason, rivers have become central to the life and culture and belief systems of many societies, with a special emphasis in mythologies. I think it is also important to have a special focus on the location of the river Gjöll, which according to the text is close to Hell, the realm of the dead in Norse mythology. Water is predominantly seen as a symbol of life in most religious traditions. However, it also has strong associations with death. And I have already talked about this in another video entirely dedicated to this subject. However, I think it is good to remember that in many texts of Old Norse literature, the sea and rivers appear very often in which drowning is possible. And in fact, in many cases, those who drown always end up in the other world or in the underworld or another realm of the afterlife. In several traditional cultures, we see rivers, lakes, and seas as waterscapes that must be navigated or crossed in the journey of death, not only by drowning, which seems to be, in certain cases, of course, a ritual sacrifice method, but we also see this relationship in archaeology between navigation and the element of water as a means to reach the afterlife or the other world. In fact, in the prose Edda, the god Hermodr rides Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, towards the river Gjöll, in an attempt to rescue Balder from Hell's domains, that is, bring him back from the world of the dead. The god Balder himself had ridden previously to Hell with 500 men. Here we have the horse as a mediator of worlds, the vehicle which facilitates the journey between realms, a theme that I have already mentioned in other videos, but we focus here mainly on the myth of Balder's death, which also illustrates the association of crossing rivers or seas with the journey of death, because Balder's body is also placed on a ship during his funeral, and the idea is to set sail into the realm of the dead. This kind of myths can be verified by archaeology. Burials are often found with horses alongside ships, especially in late Iron Age Scandinavia. Mythology is an important cultural element of a society. As such, much of social behaviors are determined by mythical events, and vice versa. Based on this particular myth about Balder's death and connecting it with the archaeological evidences from grave contexts, the presence of ships or boats is clearly significant for these historical periods and had a great weight on mythological conceptions and traditional beliefs. Hence, we understand that water environments played an important role for the ancient Norse peoples, both concerning life and in death, both physically and symbolically. Let's go back to the previously mentioned rivers that depart from the spring Hvergelmir. The attribution of names to mythological landscape features has a very significant cultural importance because it maintains the link between the religious and the natural as a form of constructing knowledge. The act of naming things is a cognitive process that helps human understanding, helping human beings to build and understand the world around them. Names are normally used to address the experienced world, but they can also be used to imagine how the world should be and what we want it to be. In the case that we are now dealing with in terms of Norse mythology, and these rivers in particular, we have a traditional religious expression of the Nordic society, and that reveals a relationship with the process of attributing meaning to landscapes, which in turn contributes to the knowledge on cognitive landscapes with details of areas that are either understood as beneficial or as less good or even dangerous. That is, naming something builds an understanding of that thing, and from the moment there is an association between idea and space, generations of human beings understand what these spaces mean and what they can bring to human society. So spaces are either avoided or used depending on their names and the information those names highlight. Naming spaces is not only a way of experiencing the world around us, but also a way of survival. So here I show you on the screen the rivers and their names, and as you can probably see, some rivers or some river names tend to be characterized by negative meanings. This negativity linked to the names are an example of the understanding of the cognitive waterscapes, presenting a fear shared among the Nordic peoples in relation to these environments. Of course, not everything is bad or negative, and even what seems negative to us may not have been understood as such by those who named these rivers, as the relationships with water environments have multiple meanings according to the multiplicity of uses and functions of those same environments. But I think we can recognize that a certain fear is here implicit, and it may have probably played an important role in the social imaginary of these societies. The fear expressed by the cognitive waterscapes in mythology is part of the cultural construction of ancient Nordic peoples in relation to bodies of water, which then resulted in imaginary conceptions that have been prolonged over the centuries. And this is where I want to get precisely, at least in the third part of this theme. In Nordic folklore, we have the sort of metamorphic spirit of water, Nyker, Nyken, which in Scandinavian traditions highlights the complex relationship with such water environments, especially in relation to the danger and fear they arouse among the people. The names of bodies of water that have previously constructed a meaning in order to express danger and a place to be cautious about and even avoid gained a folkloric expression, the manifestation of a being as the extended danger to reinforce fear and to augment the means of survival by forcing people to avoid danger even more, lest they come face to face with the very spirit of a dangerous environment, Nyken, the Nyker. But that's a topic for another video. But remember this. In another passage in Gylfaginning, we have other names for various rivers throughout the landscape where the Aesir gods live. According to the text, there seems to be two groups of rivers, since these two groups are separated. 12 rivers that flow in Hrossgarðr, realm of the gods, Aesir, and 12 others that flow in unspecified locations. The number of rivers for each group is not at random, mind you, given that the number 12 is often used to designate a group of deities or important and brave heroes or legendary heroes in medieval periods. So the number of rivers presented here is relevant. However, in this case, instead of deities or heroes, they are rivers that hold a prominent position, as they are referred to by proper names during the explanation of an event that concerns the gods and the slain warriors selected in battle, the Heinerjar. I'll put the names of the rivers and their translations here on the screen as close as possible, so that we can understand the meanings. If we compare with the 10 rivers flowing out of Hvergelmir we have previously seen, we can see that there is a certain discordance, per se, between the names. We have repeated the rivers Gunndr or Gunnthr, Fjörni or Fjörn, and Fimbulthul, with Gunndr being the river that appears in the three cases. Fjörni appears as a river both flowing out of Hvergelmir and also passing through Ásgarður, and finally Fimbulthul, the same thing, leaving Hvergelmir and passing through Ásgarður. So these last two seem to be rivers that specifically also flow through Ásgarður from their original source, Hvergelmir. However, Gunnthr appears in all the examples. There is a slight difference in the way of writing, but they mean the exact same thing. They could be different rivers receiving the same name according to what it was supposed to indicate in the myths, being connected to the same thing. But, of course, a more academic understanding, the set of Nordic myths is not unified, suffering variations in themes, contents, and structures. Variations can occur even within the same work. We may well be in the presence of different myths from different times, and for that reason there are repetitions in different contexts when putting together all the information to try to create a general mythological geography. We are faced with a mythological landscape in evolution over time, and certain meanings are lost or maintained or added or even duplicated depending on their importance and what meaning people wanted to highlight the most. I think it is also always useful to remember that although the mythical thought operates in a relatively discontinuous way, there are always breaks in the themes, but also information that is altered, distorted, erased, or forgotten, but also added. However, for pre-industrial societies, the myth is linked to the concrete historical conditions in which it emerged, a product of different times, experiences, cultures, and different social and religious behaviors. So its meaning is, mostly through metaphorical language, an expression of the feelings of the various ancient societies. That is why it is not difficult to understand the mythological rivers that we are dealing with here, especially in Nordic mythology. We see a lot that these specific rivers are both the source of life and death, important paths in the life of ancient societies. But it is also curious that the great majority depart or flow from or into inhospitable places in relation to the real Nordic geography. In this case, we are dealing with an Icelandic literary work, and indeed Nordic mythological landscapes often reflect Icelandic and not Scandinavian reality. So it reinforces this real contact with the geography in which the myth makers are inserted or were inserted. But of course, this source of life that is also very much reflected in these mythological rivers, especially dealing with the cosmological environment, illustrates the association that the Old Norse thought established between the water environment and conditions favorable to primordial life, which is common to see in so many mythologies. We see this focus of life and death on bodies of water in Celtic and Lusitanian mythologies as an example, and legends as well, where the vast majority of deities and other beings in one way or another are intimately connected with water. This aspect is well illustrated by the conditions of the emergence of Ymir as well, the primordial cosmic being, but also by its blood, body fluid that is associated with life, being later transformed into the sea and the lakes. Also, one of the most striking features of the sea in the medieval Nordic imagination involves the delimitation of areas, such as the separation between land and sea and the borders in between that would be understood as regions of the giants or of other beings outside the reality of the divine and outside the reality of the human reality. There is the flowing idea regarding the sea as a delimiter of lands, and I quote, "Then Odin went to the north, where he came across the sea, which he thought encircled all lands." Or in another passage about the arrangement of the world created by the gods, in which the earth is circular and around it is the deep sea, and along the coasts it is the abode of giants, or the gods themselves, when creating the world, pushed off the giants into these coastal areas. We understand that the northern region is eminently maritime, and that the coasts function as a boundary zone for the giants' domains. I think I've mentioned this in the other video, that both in Norse mythology and folklore, the North is always understood as the world of the dead, and to get there you have to cross the sea. And in relation to the giants, there are no specifications as to where the giants live in coastal areas, but they are not only restricted to such locations, of course, and may also live in forests and mountains. When it comes to Norse mythology giants, they are almost always associated with landscape features that serve as a boundary between the wild and the domesticated, between the unexplored habitats and civilized habitats. But quite often there is this association beyond the sea or a river, which is also always the realm of the giants. Somewhere beyond the sea. In fact, I've spoken about this in a video I did about Thor. Thor, in the myths, is often connected with boundaries, and he is one of the few gods that is able to cross every boundary. And each time Thor goes into the land of giants, he has to cross a river or a sea. Bodies of water representing the unknown, realities outside the familiar world. The race of giants is always associated with a peripheral, liminal region, since on one side there is the terrestrial surface and on the other the deep sea, so designated in the sources. Speaking of coastal areas and water as a source of life, of course we have to remember that the coastal area is also mentioned in the sources related to the creation of humanity. After the creation of the world, the three gods walked along the sea coastline, and they found two logs and created the first human beings from them, from these logs. The first god gave them breath, the second god gave them life, and the third god gave them hearing and sight. And the man was called Oskr, and the woman called Hembla. One of these days I will focus a lot more on this particular myth, but it is interesting to note that this environment bordering the sea provided the gods with the material to create man and woman, being, again, a place associated with life, with creation of life, associated to the emergence of the first life. Water, once again, being the link between human beings and life, between human beings and their very existence. Coastal zones occupy one of the most dynamic environments on Earth and support some of the most diverse and productive habitats. Since we are dealing with medieval Icelandic texts, it is worth mentioning that the medieval Icelandic population inhabited coastal areas, which also occurred in, of course, other Scandinavian regions, such as Norway and Sweden, since the conditions of the hinterlands, mainly from central regions, were too harsh for subsistence. In Scandinavia, settlements and villages are located on accesses to the sea or in coastal areas. No part of Scandinavian settlements in the Viking Age or otherwise during the Iron Age and medieval times was far from the sea, or at least it was close to rivers with quick and easy access to the sea. The Nordic myth of human creation, therefore, is intimately tied to the practical day-to-day life of these peoples. The sea as a source of life and subsistence, entry and exit of products, cultures, populations, but also with a great weight on the economy of these areas and times and even internal circulation. I already said in another video, I don't remember which one, that due to the amount of forests and mountains and the very rough terrain in Scandinavia, during practically the entire Bronze and Iron Ages in Scandinavia, the sea became the main route of communication. Just so you have a better notion, there are 11th century accounts which tells us that a journey by land from Stockholm to a region called Sigtuna, which is more or less only 40 kilometers, about 24 miles, took a month to get there by land, while by sea it took only 5 days. Water easily became the main element that provided circulation of peoples and products and ideas, and certainly the very element that facilitated the spreading of mythological accounts and belief systems. But returning to the idea of water as a source of life, I cannot end this video without speaking of Yggdrasil, the world tree, or the tree of life. No tree grows without water. The sacred and central place of the gods is the ash tree Yggdrasil. It is a tree of great dimensions, responsible for sustaining the realms of Norse cosmology, and it can be considered one of the axis mundi of Norse mythology. The centrality of Yggdrasil is also relevant concerning the waterscapes of Old Norse myths, as its maintenance, the nourishment of the large ash tree, needs water. In the literary sources, mentions are made of 3 important springs, making it possible to delineate more features of the mythological waterscapes in Nordic cosmology. Therefore, in the prose Edda, Yggdrasil has 3 roots, and under each of them there is a spring: Hvergelmir, Mímisbrunnr, and Urðarbrunnr. However, I must say that this arrangement may reflect Snorre Sturluson's systematization rather than the cosmological structure inherent to Norse mythology, as the distinctions of these roots are not found in the poetic Edda and other earlier accounts. Most historians of religions consider that there would only be a single tree and a single well, which matches other religious structures concerning trees of life and the axis mundi. Quite possibly the source of life would be Hvergelmir, or some other spring whose earlier name we don't know, from which all rivers originate, and therefore also the tree of life itself. Even so, it is relevant to ponder about the 3 sources highlighted by Snorre Sturluson in order to verify which meanings were attributed to them by Snorre. Hvergelmir, already discussed previously, is a primordial source of considerable size. Other rivers flow from it, which is located in the center of Niflheim, the region of extreme cold. Here, however, we have the additional information that the waters of Hvergelmir are under a great root of Yggdrasil, and there dwells Nidhogr, sometimes identified as a serpent, sometimes as a dragon. It is not strange that Hvergelmir is home to a serpent or dragon, Nidhogr. It is quite common in earlier mythologies and religious conceptions to have the serpent as an animal associated with the underworld, wisdom, origins of life and fertility, but also with the progressive Christianization of ancient myths, the serpent or dragon becomes a monster and a chaotic element that destabilizes the current order. In this case, Nidhogr gnaws upon one of the roots that sustains the world. Under another root of Yggdrasil is Mímisbrunnr, the well of Mimir, probably located in Jotunheimr, realm of the giants, since the root in question is found, as the text says, among the giants of ice. Unlike Hvergelmir, Mímisbrunnr is not associated with negative aspects by Snorre, but with a repository of great wisdom, which is curious because in earlier myths wisdom would be associated with the serpent, and therefore with the Christianization of these myths the serpent becomes a symbol of evil. Snorre was probably forced to move the source of wisdom away from a serpent association, highlighting another well instead for that association. Mimir is a remarkably wise giant who makes use of Gjallarhorn, a horn also used by the god Heimdallr as a trumpet. And Mimir uses it to drink from the waters of the spring named after him. So we see here that Mimir's wisdom comes from consuming the waters of wisdom, a new element as a kind of guardian of the waters of wisdom instead of the serpent. Even at the end of time, Odin will write to him, to Mimir, to receive his advice. The giant Mimir is associated with wisdom, great wisdom, but this comes from the waters of the spring since the text itself indicates that the giant is full of wisdom because he drinks from the spring using Gjallarhorn. This spring is unique for providing vast knowledge to those who drink it. In fact, in stanzas 28 and 29 of Voluspo, depending on the versions that each one has, the first poem of the Poetic Edda, a mention is made of the sacrifice performed by Odin to acquire such knowledge. In exchange for a sip of the waters of Mímisbrunnr, the god sacrifices his eye at the guardian's demand. I will not talk here in this video about the Celtic influences of this myth and the head of Mimir and the conception of the cult of the severed heads as offerings to bodies of water. But it will do well to remind that not all these elements are the product of a Christian religious understanding, but it seems that Snorre separated the source of wisdom from the serpent and placed it in another well or spring, linking different myths and thus building a reality for Yggdrasil that did not exist before. As for Urðarbrunnr, it is a spring or a well that stands out for its sacred waters and its relationship with swans and Norns. Very quickly and greatly summarized here, Norns are feminine mythological figures often associated with manipulating the fate of others. In Gylfaginning, 3 Norns, Hurdr, Verrandi, and Skull, are portrayed as inhabiting near the spring Urðarbrunnr, and also as caretakers and guardians of Yggdrasil, as they collect water and mud from Urðarbrunnr every day and pour it over the tree so that it does not rot. The life and care of the Norns enhance the sacred character of both these female beings and the spring itself and the tree. It would not be strange that in earlier myths the Norns would have been associated with the same spring from which life originates. A single spring or well, since being the central source of life, it would also be the source that guides the destinies of the populations that live near the rivers and need them to live, such rivers that flow out of the central spring of life. Personally, I find these elements of the sacred feminine linked to the waters of destiny and magic quite curious, which is quite common in Celtic mythologies as well as in Lusitanian mythology and Galician and Portuguese folklore to this day. Well, moving on. Perhaps it can be interpreted that one of Yggdrasil's sources of sustenance is sacredness itself, represented by the waters of this well, Urðarbrunnr. Also, it is relevant to say that 2 birds feed on Urðarbrunnr, and they are called svanir, swans, which also indicates the sacred character of these animals in Norse myths. Swans have a special place in the human psyche for a long time, strengthened in legends and myths and tales and legends from Russia, Scandinavia and Ireland, which are much more likely to refer specifically to the wild swan. In addition, ancient inhabitants of Scandinavia probably had more contact with this species of swan, the wild swan, which is a bird of northern ponds and shallow lakes, where it feeds on cane fields and occasionally also inhabits rivers and swamps. In many occasions, the swan is also a bird associated with Valkyrjur, the Valkyries, also as feminine beings often associated with fate, but usually the fate of warriors. But nonetheless, they are feminine beings whose magic and power weaves the fate of battle and the fate of warriors, and they are associated with swans in some accounts. Anyway, each of the 3 springs, or the wells, is characterized according to the location and characters and how they interact to construct the myth. Hvergelmir, Mímisbrunnr, and Urðarbrunnr are 3 mythological springs that show us the strands of thought in the culturally construction of conceptions embedded in the cognitive waterscape, picking up elements lived and experienced in the world and conceptualizing the sacred and the religious for a better immersion with life and understanding it. These springs are sources of monsters and beasts, of wisdom and sacredness, chaos, order, and the elements that unite them to keep life moving. In addition to rivers and springs, the sea is also used in certain mythological narratives as a place characterized by the creatures that inhabit it or move through it. In the case of Voluspo, mainly negative references are linked to the maritime environment. The sea plays the role of the path for scary and uncontrollable creatures, associating the sea with the unknown, dangerous, chaotic, and the vastness of an element humanity finds hard to control and to move through it. The great serpent Jormungandr, also known as Midgard's Sormlin, serpent of Midgardr, the largest serpent in Norse mythology that inhabits the sea and encompasses Midgardr, biting its own tail. The sea, perhaps because it was seen as an element impossible to control, tame, or even domesticate, it is presented as the environment that makes possible the crossing of gigantic and uncontrollable beings, beings that can both maintain and destroy the order of things. I've already mentioned Jormungandr several times here on this channel as a symbol of protection of the world and an uncontrollable and necessary element to maintain order, the separation of chaos and order, but which also serves as an element possessing great magic and power and magical power. An ancient magic from the depths of the sea, alluding to the element of water, in this case the sea, as the space of origin for or of primordial life, and as such the most powerful and ancient beings inhabit it, whom not even the god Thor is able to defeat. Although in more recent myths, Snorre Sturluson ends up writing that the great serpent is finally destroyed, which is curious for two reasons. There is a clear Christian understanding here, seeing the serpent as an element of evil, but the very death or destruction of the great serpent is not at all just or only a Christian thing, though it appears to have been misunderstood by Christians like Snorre. Since the great serpent was the protective element of earth and life, its death is inevitable for the destruction of the world itself to be remade once more. Quite possibly Snorre changed the order of the myths to fit his Christian understanding, because most likely the pagan understanding is that Thor tried so hard to kill the serpent that one day he managed to do so, and in doing so he committed the biggest mistake, leading to the destruction of the only being that protected the world from chaos. And with the death of the great serpent, the doors are opened to the chaotic forces and elements that will destroy the world, giving rise to Ragnarok. But that is a topic for another time. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and may it be useful. This is the first part, and next I shall proceed with the second part, obviously, which will be about the gods of the sea, probably. And only then can we proceed to talk about the Nykker, or the Nykken, the water spirit. Once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell. Somewhere beyond the sea, someone is waiting for me. And I forgot the rest of the lyrics, but it doesn't matter. Boo boo la It's very difficult to understand my own writing.